Welcome to Night Shift Knowledge, a quiet place in the late hours where you can finally let go of the day. Take a moment to settle in, soften your shoulders, and allow the busy world to fade completely into the background. Tonight, we are going on a gentle journey through the fascinating corners of science, biology, and history. Before we begin, please know that the screen will fade to dark very soon. You can safely rest your eyes and leave this video playing as you drift off to sleep. I would also love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below with a general topic you would like me to cover in a future video. It is always a pleasure to read your ideas and shape this channel around what brings you peace. If you find comfort in this space, a like and a subscribe would be deeply appreciated. To ensure the next video quietly finds its way to you, please tap the notification bell. So as your breathing slows and your room grows a little darker, let your curiosity drift along with my voice. Let us begin. Imagine the familiar hum of an airport terminal, the echoing announcements, the scent of coffee and jet fuel, the constant flow of people rushing toward their lives. Now, picture one man who is going nowhere. It is the late 1990s in Paris's Charles de Gaulle Airport. In Terminal 1, amid the chrome and glass, life moves in a predictable circle. Travelers arrive, check in, wait, and depart. But in the center of this whirlwind, there is a fixed point. A man on a red plastic bench. He is always there, sitting upright, dressed in a clean, pressed suit and tie. His few belongings are neatly stacked on a luggage cart beside him. He reads newspapers. He writes diligently in a journal. He sleeps on that same red bench, using his suitcase as a pillow. For the airport workers, the cleaners, the security guards, the shopkeepers, this man is not a traveler. He is a resident, a permanent fixture. They know him as Sir Alfred. He is polite and quiet. He is simply part of the furniture, a piece of the terminal that somehow grew a heartbeat. His name is Mehran Karimi Nasseri, and for 18 years the departure lounge of Terminal 1 was his entire world. He could not leave. He could not enter France. He was, in every practical sense, a citizen of the airport, a stateless man in a state of perpetual transit. How did he get here? That is the first, most obvious question. But the deeper mystery is why. Why, in the heart of modern Europe, in one of the world's busiest hubs, could a man be trapped for decades on a red plastic bench? This is his story. A story of lost papers, of impossible bureaucracy, and of an extraordinary community that formed in the most transient of places. Listen to the sounds of his world. Not the boarding calls, but the quieter rhythms, the soft swish of a cleaner's mop near his bench at dawn, the rustle of a fresh newspaper being left for him by a shopkeeper, the friendly, familiar greeting from a security guard. The airport staff became his lifeline. They brought him food from the cafes. They gave him magazines. They made sure he was safe. He was their unofficial charge, a protected resident of this non-place, this legal limbo called the International Transit Zone. To understand his prison, you need to understand the walls. They were made of paper, or rather, the lack of it. Nasseri's situation was what officials call a catch-22, a perfect, maddening loop. He had no valid papers to legally enter France, but to get the correct papers, he needed a fixed address within France. He had no address. He lived on a bench in a terminal, so he could not get the papers, and without the papers, he could not leave the terminal to get an address. Around and around it went. The transit zone was the only ground that would have him, a sliver of territory that is not quite one country and not quite another. It is a legal black hole, and He had fallen into it, so, day after day, year after year, the routine held. He maintained a quiet dignity, a meticulous order to his few possessions, his diaries filled with his thoughts. He became a landmark. Travellers would point him out. Some would bring him gifts. He was a local legend, a ghost of the airport, but a ghost everyone could see, a living mystery in plain sight. Everyone had the same questions. Where did he come from? What was he waiting for? And how could this possibly be happening? His story seems like a fable, a modern-day myth. But it was painfully, bureaucratically real. The red bench was his bed, his desk, his living room. The fluorescent lights of Terminal 1 were his sun and moon. The echoes of 1,000 goodbyes were his soundtrack. This wasn't a choice, not in any normal sense. It was a life sentence served in the loud public waiting room of the world. A man stripped of a nation, finding a strange kind of home in the one place designed for people who are just passing through. So we're left with the image. The well-dressed man. The red bench. The silent, watching airport. It's a haunting picture. It begs for an origin story. How does a life get so completely derailed? To find those answers, we must rewind. We must leave the hum of Charles de Gaulle Airport. We must travel back in time and across continents to the heat of Iran, to revolution and exile, to the beginning of a journey that would, somehow, get stuck forever on a bench in Paris. The story of how Mehran Karimi Nasseri lost his past and then lost his future is where we go next. So who was the man on the red bench? His story began far from the fluorescent lights of Terminal 1. It began in the heat and dust of the Iranian oil fields. Mehran Karimi Nasseri was born in 1945. His birthplace wasn't a typical Iranian town, it was a settlement built by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in Masjid Soliman. This is a crucial detail. Imagine a world within a world, a British-run company town in the heart of Iran. From his very first breath, Nasseri existed in a kind of borderland, a middle-class space between two cultures. He was Iranian, but the environment had a distinct British flavour. He reportedly spoke English from a young age. This bicultural upbringing shaped his entire life. It created a sense of not quite belonging to one place, a feeling that would later define his destiny. For years, his life followed a predictable path. He studied in Tehran. He later claimed to have continued his education in England for a time. By the 1970s, he was back in Iran. The country was under the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. It was a Western allied monarchy. But beneath the surface, political tensions were boiling. Then, Nasseri's story takes a dramatic turn. He claimed that in 1977 he was arrested. His alleged crime was participating in protests against the Shah's regime. He said he was expelled from Iran, stripped of his citizenship, and cast out. Now, historians and journalists have long questioned the full accuracy of this account. The verifiable facts of his early life are thin. But what's undeniable is this. By the late 1970s, Mehran Karimi Nasseri became a man in motion, a seeker of asylum. He began a slow, grinding journey across Europe, a stateless shuffle from one nation's doorstep to another. He first sought refuge in the United Kingdom, then the Netherlands, then Germany. Each country, according to his telling, examined his case, and each one ultimately said no. His quest dragged on for years. The 70s gave way to the 80s. The Shah fell. The Iranian Revolution created a new, theocratic government. This complicated his asylum claims further. Was he a victim of the old regime, or would he face danger from the new one? The bureaucratic machine churned slowly. Finally, a breakthrough seemed to come. In 1988, after over a decade in legal limbo across Europe, Belgium granted him refugee status. He had official papers and a place to go. He was to settle in Belgium. But to get there, he needed to travel, and that's where the final, devastating twist occurs. The moment that would trap him for 18 years. The story goes like this. In the summer of 1988, Nasseri was in Paris at Charles de Gaulle Airport. He was en route to London, he said, to collect his formal Belgian refugee travel documents from the authorities there. He boarded a plane, but somewhere between Paris and London, his briefcase disappeared. Vanished. And in that briefcase, he claimed, were all his papers, every single document that proved who he was and what he was. His refugee identity, his permission to travel, his entire legal existence was gone. Without those papers, he was nobody. A ghost. The British authorities at Heathrow Airport couldn't let him in, so they did the only thing they could do. They put him on a plane back to where he came from. Back to Paris, back to Charles de Gaulle. And on August the 26th, 1988, Mehran Karimi Nasseri walked back into the transit lounge of Terminal 1. He expected to sort this out, a temporary setback, a frustrating mix-up. He would explain, he would get new papers, he would continue his journey to Belgium. He presented himself to the French police, but without documents they saw no proof of his refugee status. They saw a man without a passport, a man without a visa, a man with no right to enter French territory, so they made a simple, logical, devastating decision. They told him he could not leave the airport, he could not enter France, but since he had arrived from London he was technically still in transit. He could stay in the international transit zone, a place designed for hours of waiting, not for living, just for a few days, he must have thought, while they straightened this out. He found a red plastic bench. He placed his few remaining belongings in a luggage cart next to it. He waited. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The man from the oil company settlement, the man who had crossed Europe, had reached the end of his journey. He had reached the threshold. The doorway to a new life was right there, beyond the passport control booths, but he could not step through it. He was in exile, but he was also at a dead end, stuck in the one place on earth designed for people who are going somewhere. The man on the red bench had finally stopped moving, and he would not move again for a very, very long time. So after his journey from that company town in Iran, after his claims of protest and exile, Mehran Karimi Nasseri arrived at his final threshold, the automatic doors of Charles de Gaulle Airport. It was August 1988. He presented himself to French authorities. He asked for asylum. And then he waited. He expected a process, a decision. What he got instead was a kind of legal vapor lock. A system that seized up and never let go. Because the place where he stood wasn't quite France, and it wasn't quite anywhere else. Imagine you are floating, not in water, but in law. You are in the international transit zone of an airport. It's a space designed for movement, for passing through, for not staying. Under international law, this zone is considered a sort of legal bubble. You haven't technically entered the country, so you aren't entitled to its full protections. But you also aren't free to leave. For a refugee with lost or disputed papers, this bubble can become a permanent cell. This is the grey area that trapped Mehran Nasseri, a legal black hole. And to understand why he lived on that red bench for 18 years, you have to understand the strange rules of this non-place. First, the French perspective. Officials determined Nasseri had arrived from Belgium. Under a set of rules called the Dublin Regulation, the country where a refugee first arrives is usually responsible for their claim, so France said Belgium should take him back. But Belgium had a different story. They said they'd already granted him refugee status back in 1995. They even issued travel documents for him to go to Britain. But here's where the story twists. According to reports, Nasseri refused to sign the Belgian documents. He reportedly insisted they were made out to the wrong name. He wanted them issued to Sir Alfred Mehran, a name he'd adopted from a character in a novel. Belgium said the offer was made. France said without the correct acceptance, he was still Belgium's problem. And around it went. So picture the paperwork. A single signature on a document, a point of pride over a name holding an entire human life in suspension. The Belgian government saw their duty as done. The French government saw a man who wasn't their responsibility, and caught in the middle was Nasseri himself in the transit zone. A man without a state, in a place without a clear law. This is what legal scholars call a jurisdictional void. It's a gap between systems where a person can simply fall and keep falling. We spoke with a human rights lawyer who's worked on these exact cases. She asked not to be named, but her frustration was clear. She said, "The transit zone is a fiction, a convenient fiction for states. It allows them to say, 'You are not here,' while you are physically undeniably here." The refugee conventions talk about protection from persecution, but they are silent on what happens when you're stuck in the airport where you sought that protection. So states fill that silence with bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is very good at saying no. For Nasseri, every no built the walls of his world a little higher. He couldn't enter France without papers, but he couldn't get the correct papers without an address in France. It was a perfect, maddening loop, a catch-22 made of passport stamps and official seals. And it wasn't just about France and Belgium. This was about sovereignty, the absolute right of a nation to control its borders. Letting Nasseri in, even out of pity, could be seen as setting a precedent. What if another person arrived tomorrow with a similarly tangled story, and another? The system, designed for order, had no graceful way to handle a unique human exception. So it treated him like a glitch, and it left him running in place. Human rights advocates watched his case with a kind of horrified fascination. It was a slow-motion crisis that laid everything bare. One advocate put it this way. He said his case was a stark lesson. It showed that our international protections for refugees have a seam. And if you happen to land right on that seam, you can unravel. The law saw a file with inconsistencies. We saw a man. And for years, the file won. The airport itself became his de facto guardian, and in a strange way, his jailer. Because while the French state wouldn't claim him, it also wouldn't let him starve or be harmed. That would be a scandal. So police and airport authorities made an unspoken deal. He could stay on his red bench as long as he didn't cause trouble. He was a problem they managed, not one they solved. So for 18 years the legal machinery hummed in the background. Memos were written. Positions were stated. Lawyers occasionally stirred the case. But the fundamental equation never changed. No government would take the final, definitive step to break the deadlock, to say he is our responsibility, to bring him in from the legal cold. He was in a waiting room, but the appointment he was waiting for had been permanently cancelled. The system had placed him in a box labelled pending, and then lost the key. Next time, what does a life in permanent pending look like? The daily reality inside the terminal, when the legal story becomes a human one. Imagine that floating sensation we ended with last time. Now imagine it lasts for a day, a week, a month. Now stretch it out for 18 years. That was the reality for Mehran Karimi Nasseri. The legal black hole became his entire world. A world with borders made of check-in desks and duty-free shops. A home with a ceiling 100 feet high and a front door he could never walk through. This is the story of that world. The terminal as a microcosm. His address was a red plastic bench in the bustling departure lounge of Terminal 1. That bench, number 37, was his bed, his office, his living room. All his worldly possessions were kept in a single luggage cart parked neatly beside it. A small, movable island in a sea of constant motion. His days followed a strict, self-imposed routine. A structure in a place designed for chaos. He'd wake early, before the first wave of flights. He'd make his way to the men's bathroom to wash and shave. He always dressed neatly. A worn but clean blazer, trousers, a tie. Maintaining that dignity was part of the ritual. Part of survival. Then, he would write, he filled notebook after notebook with his thoughts. A meticulous diary of his stationary life. He read books donated by sympathetic travelers and airport workers. He observed. For nearly 2 decades, he was the still point in the turning world of Charles de Gaulle Airport. He watched families reunite with tears. He saw business travelers sprinting for gates. He witnessed a million hellos and goodbyes, while he himself remained in the perpetual middle. And here's where the human story truly deepens. Beyond the legal oddity. Psychologists have a term for what happens to someone in this situation. Institutionalization. It's when an institution, like a prison or a hospital, becomes a person's entire universe. Their known world. The outside becomes abstract, threatening. Even if that institution is, by design, a place of temporary transit. Think about it. The airport was his prison. But it was also his protector. It had rules he understood. It provided, in its way, the fluorescent lights were always on. The temperature was controlled. It was safe. Predictable. The real France, just past the automatic doors, was a blur of noise and unknown rules. After so many years, leaving the terminal wasn't a liberation to be desired. It was a terrifying prospect to be feared. The airport wasn't just where he was stuck. It had become home. This duality defined his existence. He was a legal ghost, a bureaucratic non-person. Yet, within the micro-society of the airport, he was a known entity, a cared-for fixture. The kindness he received came from the people who shared his daily space. The airport workers, the cleaning staff who would bring him sandwiches, the security guards who, instead of moving him along, made sure he was left alone, the shop workers who gave him newspapers. They formed an informal, unspoken community of caretakers. He was their collective responsibility, their peculiar pet, a living good luck charm. This created a stark contrast, one that speaks volumes about human nature versus systemic failure. The state, the bureaucracy, the governments, they saw a file, a problem with no solution. A man without papers. They saw a legal catch-22 and shrugged. But the people saw a man. A quiet, polite man on a red bench, and they responded with basic human compassion. A sandwich isn't a passport, but it is an acknowledgement. You exist. You are here. We see you. So he lived in this strange balance. Legally, he was invisible, a ghost in the machine. Socially, within those glass and steel walls, he was perhaps the most recognized resident of Terminal 1. He developed his own tiny economy. Journalists would interview him and leave a few francs. Travelers, having heard the legend, would stop and chat, sometimes leaving a gift. His diaries became a kind of currency. He was writing a memoir, he said. He would show the growing stack of notebooks to visitors. It was proof. Proof that this time, this life was happening, that it was real. The sounds of his world were a constant loop. The robotic female voice announcing departures, the rumble of suitcase wheels on tile, the sudden, excited babble of an arriving tour group, the quiet hum of the moving walkways. For you or me, these are sounds of journey. For him, they were the sounds of stasis. The soundtrack of a life paused, and the smells, the sterile, lemony scent of cleaning fluid, the greasy aroma of fast food from the food court, the faint, lingering perfume from the duty-free cosmetics shop. This was the atmosphere of his home. For 18 years, this was the entire scope of his experience. The same shops, the same bathrooms, the same red bench, the same cycle of sounds and smells. While outside, the world changed. The Soviet Union fell. The internet was born. Mobile phones went from bricks to sleek pocket computers. And he remained, on his bench, in his microcosm, a man living in the ultimate place of transition who could not transition. He was waiting. But for what? After so long, the original hope for papers, for a country to claim him, that must have faded into a dull background hum, like the airport's ventilation system. You stop hearing it after a while. The waiting itself became the purpose. The routine was the point. To get up, to wash, to write, to observe, to survive another day in the only world he had left. That world was about to be shattered, not by a government decree, not by a legal breakthrough, but by something else entirely, a force from across the Atlantic that would transform his quiet, strange existence into a global fairy tale. And that is where our story turns next. But for Mehran Karimi Nasseri, that world of the terminal was about to be invaded. The microcosm he had built, that quiet routine on the red bench, was about to be flooded with light. A very public, very bright light. Because while he was living in a legal limbo, his story was escaping. It was becoming a myth. And that myth was heading straight for Hollywood. It started, as these things often do, with a local curiosity, a human interest story for French newspapers and television. A strange, gentle man living in the airport. The reporters came. They found a dignified, soft-spoken man in a worn suit surrounded by his papers. And they saw a story that was, on its surface, incredibly simple. A man trapped by bureaucracy, a modern-day Robinson Crusoe in a land of moving walkways and flight announcements. That simple story was irresistible. It began to travel, from France to Britain to the United States. Magazine features, television segments, radio documentaries. The narrative that took hold was often a romantic one. The happy man of the airport. The quiet philosopher king of Terminal 1. His life was portrayed as quaint, almost charming, a quirky choice rather than a devastating legal failure. The crushing weight of his statelessness was often smoothed over. It was replaced by a focus on his peculiar daily habits. His diary, his neat appearance, the kindness of the staff. It was a feel-good story about a man who seemed, to the outside world, content. And that's when the big machine noticed. The one that specializes in turning complex human truths into universal, emotional stories. Hollywood. In the early 2000s, producers acquired the rights to Nasseri's life story. The project landed with one of the most powerful storytellers on the planet, Steven Spielberg. The result was the 2004 film The Terminal, starring Tom Hanks. Now, the film is not a biography. It is, as they say, inspired by true events, and the fictionalizations are massive. Tom Hanks plays Viktor Navorsky, a traveler from a fictional Eastern European country. It erupts in a coup while he's in the air. His papers become invalid. He's trapped in the transit lounge of New York's JFK Airport. Not the departure lounge, he's charming and resourceful. He learns English. He gets a job. He falls in love with a flight attendant, played by Catherine Zeta-Jones. He becomes a hero to the airport workers. It's a film about friendship, romance, and the triumph of the little guy. Compare that to the reality. Nasseri was not a tourist in transit. He was a refugee seeking asylum. His trap was made of lost documents and cold legal rulings, not a fictional war. There was no romantic subplot, no job. His relationships, while real, were with cleaners and security guards who brought him sandwiches. His story was not one of cheerful adaptation. It was one of profound, grinding stagnation. And then there was the money. It was widely reported that Nasseri received a substantial, undisclosed settlement from the film's producers for the rights to his story. Some reports put the figure in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. This money, however, did not change his situation. He reportedly kept the check, or the paperwork, tucked among his possessions on the red bench, a piece of paper that represented a fortune, yet it could not buy him the one thing he needed, a legal identity. So, what was the impact of all this? Did the film and the global fame help him? In the most direct sense, no. The film's release in 2004 did not break the legal logjam. He remained on his bench for 2 more years. If anything, the Hollywood version created a powerful, competing narrative. For millions of people around the world, the story of the man who lived in an airport was now the heartwarming tale of Viktor Navorsky. The messy, painful, politically charged reality of Mehran Karimi Nasseri was obscured. It was simplified and made palatable. The tragedy of statelessness, the failure of international systems, was repackaged as a comedy drama with a happy ending. The public could now think they understood his plight because they'd seen the movie. But they understood a fairy tale. Yet the attention did something else. It created a strange kind of protection. He was no longer just an anonymous man in a legal black hole. He was an international celebrity, a symbol. That made it harder for the authorities to simply make him disappear. The world was watching, in a way. The media spotlight, for all its distortions, may have guaranteed his safety. It ensured he was fed, looked after, and left alone on his red bench. But it also froze him in a role. He became the terminal man, not a person with a past and a suffering, but a character, a living piece of urban legend. Some reports even suggest he began to lean into the myth, to perform a version of himself for the journalists who still came. The real man, with his complex history and his psychological scars, was buried deeper under the weight of his own story. So picture that scene in the early 2000s. The film crews would come to Terminal 1. They'd interview the real man on the red bench, the man who inspired the movie. And then they'd leave, and he would stay. The Hollywood machine had taken his life, transformed it, and sold it to the world. It had given him a check he couldn't cash, and a fame that couldn't free him. He was now both more famous and more trapped than ever. The myth was complete. And the man was still inside it, waiting. But the lights eventually dim. The film crews pack up and leave. The premiere of The Terminal becomes a memory. And for Mehran Karimi Nasseri, life on the red bench slowly returns to its quiet rhythm. The world moves on. But the terminal does not, and neither does he. For 2 more years he remains. A fixed point in the chaos of departures and arrivals. His hair and beard grow whiter, his movements become a little slower. The diaries fill. The routine holds, but by the summer of 2006, something shifts. Airport officials notice a change, a decline. There's growing concern for his well-being after nearly 18 years in that sterile environment. Then, in July of that year, the routine breaks. Airport authorities intervene, citing health and safety. They arrange for his hospitalization. One day, he is simply gone. The red bench is empty. The luggage cart, with all his possessions, is cleared away. The most famous resident of Charles de Gaulle Airport has finally left. But he isn't going home, because he has none. He's simply moving from one form of care to another. After the hospital, he's placed in a Paris shelter. For the first time in almost 2 decades, he has a roof that isn't a terminal ceiling, walls that aren't glass, a bed that isn't a bench. On paper, he's entered France, but in his mind, the journey ended long ago. Reports describe a man profoundly changed by his ordeal. He became withdrawn, reluctant to engage with the outside world that made him a celebrity. The man who spoke to journalists retreated into silence. The terminal hadn't just been his home. It had become his entire universe. Outside of it, he seemed lost. He lived in that shelter for 16 years. A quiet, private existence, far from the echoing halls of Terminal 1. Then, in November of 2022, the journey truly ended. Mehran Karimi Nasseri died in Paris. He was 77 years old. The news travelled the globe just as his story had decades before. Obituaries remembered the man who lived in an airport. They mentioned the Hollywood film, The Red Bench, The Lost Papers. But behind the myth, what was left? What does his story actually mean? On one level, it's a stark lesson in bureaucratic failure. A lesson written in 18 years of a single life. He was caught in a perfect trap. No papers to enter France, but no French address to get the papers. A loop with no exit. Governments pointed fingers. Lawyers filed appeals, and a man waited on a plastic bench. His story forces us to ask, what happens when the systems we build to protect people instead consume them? When a stamp on a document matters more than the person holding it? It also asks a deeper question. What is home? For Nasseri, home became a transit lounge, a non-place. It was the smell of jet fuel and floor cleaner, the sound of rolling suitcases and boarding calls, the kindness of strangers who brought him sandwiches and magazines. It was a small territory where he was known, where he had a strange kind of safety. In the shelter, with real walls and a real bed, he was anonymous. Just another face. Perhaps the terminal, for all its hardness, was the only home his fractured life could accommodate. Then there's the legacy of the myth. The Hollywood version gave us a feel-good fable, a charming tale of resilience. But the real story is darker. It isn't about triumph, it's about endurance. It's about the human capacity to adapt to impossible situations, to build a life in the cracks of the world. Nasseri became a symbol for millions of stateless people globally, people who exist in a legal void, who belong nowhere. Their papers are lost or never issued. They're trapped in camps and detention centers. They don't have a Hollywood ending. Most don't have an ending at all. So why do we remember him? Perhaps because his prison was so public, so ordinary. We've all been in an airport. We've all seen those benches. We can picture him there. His story makes the abstract painfully concrete. It takes the invisible crisis of statelessness and places it in the middle of our modern temple of movement. He was the man who could not move, a monument to stillness in a palace of motion. In the end, the terminal didn't let him go easily, and perhaps he never really let go of it. He lived there for 18 years. He carried it with him for 16 more. His story is a closed loop, a circle that begins and ends with a simple lack. A lack of a country, a lack of a paper, a lack of a place to be. The next time you're in an airport, rushing to a gate, listen for a moment. Past the announcements, past the chatter. You might hear the echo of a story, of a man who made his home in the in-between, who turned a waiting room into a life. His red bench is gone now, but the questions he left behind, they are still very much with us. We have reached the end of tonight's topics, and it is time to let your mind completely unwind. Whatever you learned tonight, let it fade into a soft hum as you drift off. Thank you for being a part of Night Shift Knowledge and sharing this quiet space with me. Remember to leave a topic suggestion for next time if you are still awake, but for now, just rest. Sleep well, and I will be here the next time you need to quiet your mind. Good night.